Welcome back, Richard. It's good to see you again.
Hey, Bernie, how are you?
I am doing all right. So
Okay.
last week, we ushered in and welcomed the new school year, and we talked about electronics and how parents, some strategies and helping parents develop a plan for managing electronic use as they're starting the school year. And this week, we are going to talk a little bit more about electronics use because, well, there's some recent information that's come out that we've been reading about, and it's just an important topic.
Right. Last week we talked about this contest that parents have at this time of year, beginning of school, and kids still want to play their video games and they want to be on social media and digital media. And there's going to be this contest between school-age children taking care of their obligations versus having free time to be on their devices.
Right.
And one of the most frequent complaints that we get is that parents will come in and say, she's addicted to her phone. He's addicted to his video game. They use this word addiction. They're addicted. And we assume when parents tell us that what they're talking about is that the child is plugged in, head down, silent, relentlessly surfing and scrolling and binging, in constant communication with all these people that they're all their friends, while they're ignoring the real people who are in the same car, or in the same house, or in the same restaurant. We hear this all the time. Kids are on their devices rather than being with the people who are present.
Yeah.
And in a recent interview that we ran into, there was an interview of this Stanford professor who happens to be an addiction expert. She wrote a book called Dopamine Nation. And in the interview, she makes this argument that digital media, including social media like Snapchat and Instagram, should be considered an addictive substance. Okay, that it produces these activities that we do on our devices. They produce dopamine, and it's dopamine that is the addiction. Okay. And so we thought, wow, that's kind of what parents are saying, is that the kids are addicted. So is it just this dopamine release and it makes you feel good, and so you keep doing it? And we thought, yeah, that has certain appeal. But then when you and I discussed it, we thought, well, wait a minute. Maybe it is, but there are some differences. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Is it an addiction?
Right. And yes, we have talked about this on the podcast in the past. And because, well, as we will talk about again, we do have some concerns about the idea of viewing it as an addiction per se, because when I think of addiction, I think of it from a clinical perspective as it relates to, developing treatments and what we need to do in response so that we can help the person recover. When we think about addictions, if you just look at the dictionary definition, what we're talking about is compulsive and chronic use of something. Usually there's a psychological or physiological need for this substance, but it can be a substance like a drug or a chemical, but also a behavior or some activity, and the person, an addiction could also be just defined as a strong inclination towards doing a particular thing, using something, indulging in some kind of activity, or doing some type of behavior. Right. So yes, from that definition, you can see how very easily we can move into the direction of saying that social media and use of electronics is an addiction. But again, when we think about it in the clinical sense, I think we have to be a little bit careful. And so again, we're going to kind of talk about that some today.
Right. Because we think of addiction, we associate it typically with drugs or some chemical, a substance like a drug. We talk about a drug addict or an alcoholic. But we also know that people gamble compulsively, and that some people exercise compulsively, some people eat compulsively. So we know there are these compulsive behaviors, but are they true addictions? Okay. What this professor is saying is that addiction is the response that's produced by the substance. So we can be addicted in that sense. We can be addicted to anything that produces the responance.
Well,
Okay?
and by the response, you mean the dopamine release. The release
Yeah,
of
dopamine
in the brain.
gets released and it makes you feel good.
Right.
Okay. That's typically what people think about when they think of dopamine. It's not the only thing that dopamine does,
Sure.
but it's the dopamine release. And in fact, all the addictive substance we know of release dopamine. I mean,
Right.
it's the dopamine that you're after, because dopamine activates the pleasure centers of the brain. And about 30% of our brain is a pleasure center. A lot of our brain is a pleasure center. And so dopamine activates those pleasure centers and it feels good. So she's saying that anything that does that, we should consider addictive. But we want to be careful with that notion, because there are these key differences. Okay.
Right. And especially because, again, we've said this before, but it's important to emphasize that anything that you enjoy releases dopamine.
That's right. Right.
Anything that you do that you enjoy releases dopamine. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that just because you enjoy something means that it's an addiction.
Right. Right.
Because, somebody really enjoys reading and they can spend, 10 hours a day reading.
Right.
But have you ever heard of anybody talking about somebody as having a reading addiction?
Right. She's addicted. Right.
Right. Usually it's something, and even if it interferes with functioning, because if you're reading, but you're supposed to be doing something else, it's interfering with functioning, but we still don't call it an addiction.
Right. And even though it's a worthwhile activity, well, I'm getting a little bit ahead, but
right.
There are two key differences,
right,
that we want to talk about. One has to do with withdrawal, physiologic addiction, and the withdrawal that a person experiences. That's one thing. The other thing is what the other problem is excessive use. And this is a little bit tricky to talk about, but with electronic devices, social media, however you want to term it, the second issue is excessive use, not use, but excessive use. But let's talk about withdrawal first, okay? Because that's an important, I think, distinguishing characteristic between electronic devices and an addictive substance.
Right. And I think that it's also the difference between chemical substances and other things that we refer to as addictions, whether it's gambling or anything else. And that is that it creates, withdrawal creates a physiological symptoms, predictable physiological symptoms in the body. If you are an alcoholic and you stop drinking, there are predictable symptoms that you will experience as a result of that withdrawal.
That's right.
Now, if you are quote unquote addicted to Snapchat or Instagram or TikTok, and your device is removed and you now no longer have access to that, you don't have physiological symptoms associated with it. You might get angry, get really irritable and frustrated, but it's not a physiological withdrawal like you see with chemical addiction.
That's right. And please, parents, please hear that. Just because your child gets angry, anger is not physiologic withdrawal.
Right.
They're two completely different things. Yeah, your child's going to be angry. They want Snapchat. They want Instagram. If you take her phone, yes, you're going to get pushback. You're going to get a reaction. That's not withdrawal.
Right.
It's a different response.
Right. So think about what you experience, because I think most people can relate to this. Think about what you experience when you try to, if you're a coffee drinker or you drink sodas or tea or anything like that, and you decide that you're going to stop caffeine.
Right.
There is a physiological response to stopping caffeine.
You're going to get a headache.
And it doesn't matter. It's there. It's just, and you may, but then at the same time, when you stop, if you stop doing something else that you enjoy just because you enjoy doing it, you may get frustrated that you can't do it. You may feel that urge, that tendency to gravitate towards, whatever that hobby is or anything, but you don't experience the same physiological change, the same physiological symptoms as when you stop a substance that your body is accustomed to.
Right. We just finished all of our summer vacations, and many, many times during the summer, people would say, oh, we went to such and such a place and we didn't have cell phone use. We couldn't use our cell phones. And it was great. We talked and we had fun and we played games, and we actually had a great time because nobody could use their cell phones. There was no physiologic withdrawal. Nobody got headaches. Nobody was cramping. Nobody was balled up in cold sweats. No, you had a great time because you didn't have your devices. That's what we're talking about. This is not, it's not truly addiction. And one of the reasons is because of the physiologic response.
Right.
Okay? So the second issue is the challenge for all of us managing our children, but managing our own use is excessive use of a device. Okay. Right. That's what we're talking about. Now, some might argue, well, that's what we're talking about with alcohol. We're talking about excessive use of alcohol. Rather, no, that's not what we're talking about. We have to start focusing on, we have to move away from this idea that, well, I'll take her phone. Just if she's doing something, we're gonna take her phone.
Right.
We need to move away from that. And you have to, if you're a parent or a partner or an adult, doesn't matter, you have to start thinking of, how do I use this device mindfully? How do I use it wisely?
Right.
How do I avoid excessive use? You need to stop thinking of the phone as a way to punish your child, but thinking of, how do I get my child to use this device appropriately, carefully, thoughtfully?
Right. If you think about, and I think that this point is extremely important, because excessive use is exactly the issue. And we've been thinking about this a lot, and I'll share what I think it really is as opposed to addiction in just a moment. But I think that, when you think about somebody who abuses substances like alcohol or any other illicit drug or something, the goal of treatment is abstinence.
Right.
If you think about one of the most common forms of intervention for alcoholism, for example, is AA, 12-step program, right? 12-step programs are, for the most part, focused on abstinence. No more drinking.
Total
abstinence. No more drinking. And in fact, there are some AA groups where they don't want you using cough syrup that has any alcohol-related substances in it. They don't want you using anything that could resemble or come close to alcohol. And many of them don't even want you to use medication, because that's, in their view, that's just another chemical dependence that you're moving towards. There is, I'm just going to say it very bluntly, there is no way for you to be completely abstinent from electronics. Right. It's just not possible in the world that we live in today.
Exactly.
Our kids are just started school. Next week, they are going to be, they're going to be given their iPads or their laptops starting next week for them to do all of their schoolwork on, for them to have access to all of their learning materials. It's all on electronics. There is no way that in the world that we live in today that you can be completely electronic free.
Right.
There's no way.
Right. Not unless you live in a place where there's no signal ever, not complete, or you don't have any kind of an internet connection coming into your house. But I mean, that's there are cultures that do that, but most of us have these, and most school children are going to have access to devices.
Absolutely.
Even at least while they're at school. Okay?
So there's no way that our treatment, I'm hesitant, and I think we should all be hesitant to call it an addiction when our treatment for addiction isn't the treatment that's going to work.
That's right. I mean, I think about that with people we do see who are struggling with addiction. You don't say, no, it's okay to drink a little bit, go ahead and have one or two drinks, because for binge drinkers, which is one of the things we worry about, it's not going to be one. It's going to be the first of many, and it's going to lead to problems.
Right.
And so when we advise people who are struggling with addictive behaviors, whether it's gambling or alcohol or drug, you don't say, well, it's okay to take a little bit of OxyContin. You just have to be careful. You just have, I mean, you don't say that kind of stuff. Okay. So, but that is the case with electronic devices, is that we are saying, yeah, a little bit of it is okay, but it has to be managed. Okay. You can't say that with a person who's truly physiologically addicted to a substance or to an activity. It doesn't matter what the activity is, but that's where I think this fine line between addiction to a substance versus addiction to an activity. Because even with a person who's addicted to exercise, you can say, no, we want you to exercise for an hour a day, not 5 hours a day. Okay, then it's okay.
Absolutely.
So the first issue is physiologic dependence and withdrawal,
right,
and the symptoms of withdrawal that you would have even withdrawing from caffeine. Like you say, stop drinking caffeine, you're going to get a headache. Yeah. Stop using Snapchat, you're not going to get a headache.
Right. So, and the second thing is the issue of excessive use. And so let's talk about what we mean by excessive use, because there are those who would say being on your phone for 2 hours a day is excessive use, and then you'll have others who say, yeah, I'm on my phone for 7 hours a day, and I don't think that's excessive use. All right. So excessive use, if we think about adults, excessive use is when your use of a device is interfering with, one thing is interfering with other relationships. If it's interfering with your relationship with your partner, if it's interfering with your relationship with your kids or with coworkers or friends, that's one sign that you are using the device, you're on the device too much.
Right. I remember when cell phones first came out, we were also taken by this little device that we could connect to the internet, carried around with us all day. And I can remember many people saying it changed their relationship because their partner brought it to the table, to a dinner table, that we no longer had a meal where we talked. We had a meal where my partner was on his cell phone, or when he came home from work, instead of engaging with me and the children, he was on his phone doing something, he was still connected at work. Okay. So this ability to stay connected easily 24 hours a day, and I attribute that mainly to an iPhone, this portable device. It really changed, and I might even use the word damaged, marriage or partner to partner relationships.
Absolutely. And again, it could interfere with your role as a parent. It could interfere with your work. If you find yourself surfing and scrolling on your phone when you're supposed to be working, and so you start getting behind on your obligations at your job. Also, if it's at the expense of your mental health. Richard, how many times do we talk to people and they are so stressed and overwhelmed and maybe even depressed, but the primary source of that distress is what they're reading on social media or what they're doing on their device. They see other people living these lives, and so they are down and depressed and upset because they are not doing that.
Yeah, because everybody else is having this wonderful life and I'm stuck here at home, I can't do anything. There's also this idea of doom surfing, where you're constantly looking at catastrophes, and it feels like the whole world is coming apart. It really isn't. It's just that's what's on the screen. And so we need to be careful about excess use because it can affect our mental health.
Absolutely. And it's the same thing with kids and teenagers. Excessive use, if use on their device is interfering with their functioning, whether it's, you can't get them to do their obligations at home, you can't get them to do their schoolwork, they keep getting in trouble at school because they're on their device when they're not supposed to be, they are sacrificing, interpersonal face-to-face relationships for the sake of their virtual friends. These are, indications that this could be, they could be excessive use. And it's even more concerning when it's with children and teenagers, because of course their brain is continuing to develop, and we don't know yet what effect that's going to have on them in the long run.
That's right. What we do know is that in children and teenagers, the effects are different than they are in adults. With adults, you have an adult brain by about age 25. And so with adults, we're more concerned about the effect that it has on relationships and work and mental health. With children and teens, we're concerned about the effects on brain development, because a child's brain is still developing. And so we want parents to understand that with children and teens, the problems are that that the excessive use of electronic devices could affect brain development, physiologic brain development. And the easiest way to understand it is to think of a use it or lose it phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
With electronic devices, the effects on the developing brain are that it interferes with the development of connections in your brain that allow you to be competent. When you're born, you can't do a lot of it. You can't walk and you can't speak, and you develop those things by making brain connections, by connecting all the neurons together into circuits that can do things. Okay, and I don't know whether we should tackle this topic or try to. It's a complicated topic. It's going to take a long time to talk about this, but in children, for example, child is born, has all these neurons. The neurons aren't connected, so the child can't talk and can't walk and can't do a lot of things, can't write her name. But about age 2.5 or 3, there is this explosion of new neurons in the brain. And those are the neurons that kids will use to learn to ride a tricycle and a bicycle and go to kindergarten and do reading and math skills in early elementary school. Those are the neurons. But in order for those neurons to stick around, they have to be used.
Right.
Kids have to be riding a bike and talking and thinking and coloring and drawing and playing sports and kicking balls and throwing balls. And that's how the brain develops.
Right.
Well, if you don't do those things, then those neurons are going to die off. If you never walk, the walking neurons are going to die off. Okay. Right. So that's the use it or lose it. So you have blossoming, you have those neurons, but then you have pruning, and the neurons you don't use, you lose. That's the lose it part. Well, that means that children, preschool and early elementary school, have to be doing things.
Right.
If all they do is sit in front of a television set, they're going to keep the neurons that watch television. And they're going to lose the neurons that they use for other purposes, playing sports, reading, doing math. And so if your time is spent on electronic media, you're going to lose the ability to do these other things.
Absolutely. And again, this happens again in teenagers. When once you reach adolescence, this is second opportunity, I suppose, where your brain goes through some significant, massive changes, where there's another explosion of new neurons that come into your brain and are working to make new connections, and they're trying to, set the stage for this next stage of development, this next process of development. And so these are the neurons now that you're going to use as you go through high school, and you're working with more, if you think about the class material that kids learn in high school, like algebra and trigonometry, it's much more complex and abstract. But also relationships take on a very different meaning in high school and in college. And so those neurons that develop and come about during adolescence are critical to those skills. And so just as the case that you just made with your toddlers, in adolescence, if all of your time is spent on social media and spent sort of in this virtual world, your brain doesn't have the opportunity to create those pathways and then reinforce those pathways for the types of relationships that they really should have. Those
Right.
intimate relationships, knowing how to communicate with someone that they want to have an intimate relationship with. They don't know how to make those connections and how to make those relationships because they haven't developed those skills. And so it's so important. Adolescence, we're talking about, in puberty, we're talking about middle and early high school years. If they spend all their time on social media and in electronics during that time frame, it's going to affect their ability to develop those relationships.
That's right. A good example of that. You and I hear this all the time, and especially in the summer. And during the pandemic, we heard it, and in the summer we heard it, and over holidays. And parents will say, "No, he'll spend 12 hours in his bedroom playing video games."
Right.
If you do that day after day after day, you're going to get good at playing video games. The brain will get good at what it does repeatedly. If
Right.
you are constantly running, you're going to get good at running. If you're constantly throwing baseballs, you're going to get good at throwing baseballs.
Right.
If you're constantly playing video games, you're on social media, you're watching YouTube, that's what you're going to get good at. The problem is you're not going to get good at all the other things you should be doing. You're
Right.
not going to develop physical abilities. You're
Right.
not going to develop your social skills. You're not going to develop your academic skills. Being good at Snapchat doesn't buy you very much.
Right.
I mean, I'm not saying don't ever use Snapchat. That's that idea that we're not going to ask you to stop using it, but we're saying if you spend all your day on Snapchat, you're not going to get much benefit from
Right.
that in terms of the rest of your development.
Right.
And so that's what we mean by managing an excessive use, is that excessive use makes you very good at one thing, but at the expense of everything else.
Absolutely. So as we look at, again, these two issues, the issue of that physiological withdrawal, the issue of how would we treat digital device use, unlike true addictions, our focus is not going to be on abstinence. It's going to be on appropriate use. It's going to be on reasonable use. Being on, you're going to be on your device, but how do you gauge how much time you should spend? I can't. There's no way to foresee a situation where we would say, okay, we now live in a world where we're digital device free. I just don't. There's just no way that that's going to happen. It's just too convenient, too accessible, and too prevalent. So instead, we have to focus on fair use and appropriate use. And this is where I think we have to shift that perspective, away from an addiction model. And in my mind, we need to move it more closer to almost a compulsive use or a compulsive, obsessive compulsive type of perspective. Well, I see it as very akin to, compulsive hand washing or, excessive worries about germs and things like that, where you have this, again, you take a person who has obsessive compulsive disorder where they have to wash their hands, multiple times a day, and you turn the water off. They're going to be distressed. They're going to be upset. They're going to experience some anxiety and stuff, but they're not going to experience the physiological consequences of an addiction.
Right.
Similar to an addiction. And I see the cell phone and electronic use in a very similar way to what we think about with obsessive compulsive type tendencies.
Right. So the issue is reasonable use.
Right.
And so we will always be encouraging two things. One is that these devices are privileges to use, but you have to take care of your responsibilities first.
Right.
All right. So that's the first thing, is that you're going to have this battle. And so first you take care of your responsibilities, then you can do whatever you want on your devices.
Right.
Second thing is you can't do whatever you want for 10 hours a day.
Right.
And so it's a two-part process of first your responsibilities, then free time. But the second issue is you simply don't have 5 or 6 or 7 hours a day to spend on your devices. If you do, then you're ignoring something else that's important.
Or the
And
parents haven't given them enough things to do.
or they don't have enough to do. You
Right.
don't have enough chores. You don't have enough responsibility. And so parents have, as we enter the new school year, whether you're an adult or a child, you have to manage your use carefully, because it's very easy. This stuff is compelling, and it's very easy to stay on these devices. People refer to rabbit holes. I went down the rabbit hole, or I binge watched something, or I, was on my, stayed on my device. All kids stay on their devices at night.
Mhm.
If you're on your device at 2 o'clock in the morning, it means you're giving up sleep.
Right.
Okay, and that's the problem. So one is, first you do your responsibilities, then you have your free time. The other thing is, don't get off these devices when you're giving up other things that you should be doing. For adults, it's work and relationships. For children, it's developing the other parts of their bodies and their minds.
Absolutely. So, all right, I think that's it for today. We will post in the show notes a link to that interview with the author of Dopamine Nation, and but we will certainly be talking about this topic again, because this is a very common thing that we deal with here in our practice. So,
Right.
all right. All right. Until next time, stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid.